Hi, this is Roger, thanks for dropping by. Today I'm going to film the last part of the project plant updates. So that'll be the last in the set of update 1, which I was hoping to get done in June, and today is the last day of June, so we just about made it. And then that can be put away for 3 months, and then we'll revisit the plants in 3 months' time. That's the sequence basically. So the first set of videos was 3 months ago in March, and then this will be the end of this set, and then in 3 months' time we'll get all the plants out again and do part 1, 2, 3 and 4 and repeat the process. Same set of plants, same sequence in the 4 parts. So this particular one is what I call the shadier, cooler types. It's a bit of a mix, whereas some of the other parts are not necessarily a mix. One part is Cattleya types, one part's Dendrobiums, one's Oncidiums and their allies. This one is cooler, shadier types, and it's a mix, so it's quite an assortment. And well, let's get going and see how they're doing. Oh, before I start, a bit of news. That trip I did out, it was last week now, wasn't it, to find those orchids, the person from the Orchid Society who said he'd seen them there actually gave me a ring. We had quite a long chat. You remember part of that video said about seeing the wood for the trees? Well, the information I got was that he only ever saw 2 plants, and it was about 8 years ago. So, 2 plants may not have survived. And then I found out that basically he drove along the road until he got to a little pull-in on the left-hand side with a 5-bar gate. And the 2 plants were in the ditch just opposite that gate, the other side of the road. So in fact, the 2 plants that he saw were about 10 feet from my car where I parked it on the other side of the road. Now you have to bear in mind that's where the video started, and we set off up the road. We didn't look on the opposite side of the road where the car was parked. I hadn't started looking at that point. Also, he said they were in the ditch, these 2 plants. He said they were about 3 foot tall, which is quite large even for that type of plant, and there were 2 of them. Now, for that ditch to still exist 8 years later, it must get dredged. They must go along there and empty that out of the mud and sludge that gets in the bottom, because in time a ditch will fill up and it's no longer a ditch. And obviously that's the drainage water off of the road so that the road doesn't flood. It's quite important. Now if they dredge that ditch, I can't see those plants surviving. So I'm not going to return to that place to see if I can find them. So we will try 1 or 2 of the other places maybe later this week. I'll see how I go. So we won't be returning to that area specifically to find those orchids. If there were only 2 plants there, there could be 20 plants there now, there could be none. So I'm not doing a journey on an unknown when there's other sites where I know they are. People have photographed them this year, so we can go somewhere safe. Anyway, let's get on with the task in hand. So first one up is Dracula Bella. This is a cool grower, so it's never going to do that well for me. But at the end of the day, it is growing okay. Last summer it aborted virtually every single flower spike. We have had a flower since then. I'm not sure whether it was since this picture was taken or before, but we did get a single bloom on it. Nonetheless, it's pushed up quite a few new growths, and at this time of the year all I can say was that it was doing okay, producing new growths. There's obviously a spike hanging out the bottom there at this particular point, although on this shot I think there may be one other one up to the left nearer the top of the pot, just hanging out from underneath a leaf. So there may have been 2 spikes showing, but nothing much going on apart from a steady increase in the number of leaves. which in my environment, that would have been its growing period. The 6 months prior to this picture would have been the period when it was always going to do best, and the next 6 months it's not. So it wasn't doing bad. I was quite pleased that it was still alive and growing. Okay, so progress on this one is a bit hit and miss. Some of the older leaves have got spottier, and allegedly on Masdevallia's, that is an awful leaf, that needs cutting off. Allegedly, when you start getting tipped marks on the tips of leaves specifically, they're getting too much food. That's the normal analysis of such things. Now on here, this pushes up new leaves quite frequently. That's good. What isn't good though is when new leaves have got markings like pale edges and a spot. Some are okay. So this plant's not as happy as it should be, and it's not doing bad, let's put it that way. But what is a trifle worrying, that's a when I was trying to find problems and going over them, which we've been doing in other videos, I'm not doing it again, that's a classic picture. And what's worse is this particular leaf here. So I was just checking. See now, in this particular case, the markings on the leaf are typical of this cell damage that I've been discussing. You can almost see the cells being individually outlined, but this leaf isn't pitted, so it doesn't go through to the other side. So this is a different thing on here. This got put in the live sphagnum moss, I think, and so far that sort of experiment has not been that successful. So I might end up having to repot this simply to change the media. It compacts so quickly, that's the problem. And once it compacts, it's losing the air, it's losing, the roots are losing their oxygen. And I'd have thought with a plant this large by now that there'd have been some roots escaping out of the pot, and there aren't. What we do have escaping out of the pot though is a shed load of spikes. It did that last year and very few of them actually bloomed, and we have been getting a lot of heat lately, but when they're in this stage growing on, the heat doesn't seem to affect them. But if you look at the most mature bud on there, that looks to me like it's going brown, as though it's going to blast again. So this one I think needs some work. If I ignore it, it's probably going to get worse. So I'm just trying to get the thing to hang up again. You obviously can't put the pot down, not with all those spikes hanging down. But yeah, there are quite a lot of spikes starting around the back there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 that I can see. There may be another one right round the back. But so there's a lot of spikes, but not a lot of blooms. We will see. It's not as happy as it was. It's not as green as it was. And when you get marks like that on a relatively new growth, you need to start worrying. So I think this is going to have to come out of its pot. Now with all of those spikes, I've got two choices. The plant will lift out of that basket without damaging the spikes, because they'll just thread back up through the holes. That won't be a problem. But getting them into something else will be, because ideally I'd just like to put it straight back in that pot, but with a different media. So trying to thread those back through the holes might not be so easy, but it seems to produce spikes very freely in my environment. I mean, I've known others that have had Dracula Bella that have got a job to ever get a spike. I get the spikes, they just don't mature and bloom very often, and I've always put that down to heat. But anyway, it needs some work, and I presume I better not leave it too long. So by the time we look at this next time, whatever I choose to do with it will have already been done. Playing about with a Dracula or a Masdevallia or such like when you are in the middle of a heat period is not a good idea. It's not going to settle because it's already stressed. It doesn't like the heat, yeah? And then you disturb the roots and stress it even more. So I'll have to go very careful. Now at the moment we're in for at least a week of miserable weather. So now would be a good time to do it, literally right now. But a week is nowhere near long enough for a set of roots to settle down again. But if I leave it like it is, I could lose the roots I've got. You have to weigh it up, don't you? Anyway, spikes galore, some new growths, and some older leaves looking a bit poor, and some marks that I'm just very not happy about. We shall see. Now the Coelogyne cristata, we'd had some flowers in the spring. Again, I can't remember whether they were before this picture was taken or they happened after, having lost that sort of detail in my notes. But at this particular point we'd either just finished flowering or were about to start. There were 2 spikes, one of which didn't progress. At this time of year this plant looks a little tatty. You know, the leaves are a little bit floppy, but you have to bear in mind it's not a single plant, and what I was pleased about through the winter is the pseudobulbs didn't shrivel. They're still nice and plump, so despite having the water restricted through the winter, not stopped, but restricted, there's not much growth going on in winter time. It certainly doesn't need feeding, and you know, it just needs a little trickle of water now and again. But the pseudobulbs had stayed nice and plump, so it was starting the year in a good state, rather than like some other people's with loads of shriveled pseudobulbs. So I was pleased at this point in the year. And this one's becoming a bit of a tableful. Last time we looked at this, I'm not quite sure whether it had bloomed or whether it was about to bloom, and the problem I've got is that level of detail was lost when I lost my latest version of the notes. So that sort of level's not there anymore. But we did get blooms on this year. We had 2 spikes formed, and one actually bloomed and one didn't. It just stalled. But what it's doing now is growing. Got some good new growths on here pushing on. And by this time, at this point in the year, these can be counted, because I doubt if any more are going to start this late in the year now. So we've effectively got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 new growths. Potentially that is 5 bulbs that could bloom next spring. But I'm not sure with this one whether it blooms on the previous year's growth or the 2-year-old growths. But we'll find out in the spring. Yeah, there's the little flower spike that stalled. Still there. The other one was cut off because it did actually bloom. But yeah, new growths are pushing on. There's not many of them are going to get roots down in the pot, I don't think. But with this one, it doesn't seem to matter too much. This one will. That's plenty near enough the base for some roots to get down. This one may not. This one will. That'll get roots down in the pot. This one probably won't, right up there. And this one probably will. So we will get some new roots down into the media. This isn't one plant. I forget how many it actually is, but it's probably why it hasn't bloomed very well yet. It's not a large maturing plant. It's pieces. Probably only 2 or 3 bulbs each. So each of those pieces has now got to reach maturity before it starts blooming well. But hopefully we will get some more blooms, in the spring next year. But it's growing quite nicely. The leaves are nice and green. It's one of the few plants I've got that hasn't got any problems with its leaves. Seems to be doing okay. They're a reasonable colour. They're not wishy-washy or anything like that. They're a reasonable green, and it seems to be growing okay. And since it got put in this open plastic basket, it has done an awful lot better than it ever has done for me. I've had this parts of plants for some time. But last year, having transferred the pieces into here, which is basically a lining of sphagnum, quite thick lining on the sides and on the bottom, and then the media in the middle is a mixture of sphagnum and bark. Seems to like it, so it seems to be growing better than it has done before. So yeah, reasonable progress, quite pleased with that one. Now the Masdevallia ignea was the one we tried a bit of an experiment on, based on a talk I'd heard about somebody finding one of these in the middle of a field in full sun, in full bloom. So came home and put all his Masdevallias in brighter light. So this one came up off the Shady shelf onto a top shelf, just to see if it would actually instigate some blooms, because although it seemed to grow okay, bearing in mind it's a real cool grower, you know, it shouldn't do that well for me really, certainly during the summertime anyway, but it had just come out of winter, so you know it was looking reasonably healthy with a reasonably steady stream of new growths pushing up, and old leaves not falling off at the rate of knots like some do. You know, the idea is to get more new ones than old ones falling off, so the plant gets bigger all the time, becomes stronger because it's got more leaves. So we were playing with this one a bit and putting it in a light which I would not normally expect to do for a Masdevallia. So it didn't get any direct light through the shade netting. It had other plants in the way, but on that top shelf it was getting a lot more light than it had ever seen before. I didn't give it sunglasses, but I wasn't far off because that was pretty bright light for a Masdevallia. It didn't seem to do it any harm anyway, so let's see how that got on. Now, this is the one we did the experiment with. On the theory that Masdevallias perhaps don't need such shady conditions as implied in the old ancient scrolls and things like that, geared on people actually going to the places where they grow and seeing them for real, and finding a Masdevallia ignea in the middle of an open field in full bloom, in direct sun. Okay, very cool, it was high up, but nonetheless it got the light and it was in full bloom. Right, now I don't know whether the bud was already forming on this last time we looked, but we brought it up from the shadier place and put it on a top shelf for a bit. Still shaded by other plants. It wasn't in as bright a light as the other plants on that shelf. The other plants were shading it slightly from that level of intensity, but it got brighter light. We did get a bloom as a consequence. What else did we get? Yeah? Yep. It's a repeated pattern, and in this particular case, starting to pit and infected. That's the black on it. That's a fungus infection on top of the original damage. Now the leaves on this aren't bad, and it keeps growing new ones at a fair old rate. New leaves come up frequently. Yeah? So it's replacing leaves quite frequently. Some of the older ones, you know, we've got a few spotty ones, and there's a bad one there. I wouldn't say it's unhealthy, but again, it's got planted in the live sphagnum. And so whatever ails the Dracula is going to ail this. I don't think it's going to ail it quite so soon, because this hasn't compacted anywhere near as much, and I do see a couple of roots hanging out in places. They don't tend to last long once they hang out of the basket, because obviously they're in the drier air. So this one hasn't got such a compacted media as the Dracula Bella, which might mean it can stay in its pot a bit longer. Because if I'm going to actually change this media to something, you know, with a bit more air in it, I'd like to do it in the autumn after the heat goes and the long days have gone, when it's going to be more comfortable anyway, and it should recover a bit quicker then, because it's going into its comfort zone. Normal day lengths, you know, 11 to 12 hours, and cooler temperatures. So hopefully we can wait till then. Got a feeling this bloom's on its way out now. It's been here some time, and I don't see any signs of more spikes at the moment. No. Just more new leaves basically. So yeah, that's that one. It's progressing, and we did get a bloom. I think as far as this one is concerned, it shouldn't even really be living in here. It's far too warm. This is a cold grower. You know, it's not one of these that's sort of can tolerate heat and all that. It's supposed to be grown cold. So the fact that it even survives, I'm impressed. So given the circumstances I'm growing it in, I'd say it's doing as well as can be expected. So I'll leave it at that. Right, this is one of the 3 Masdevallias that came from Eric Young Foundation. They were bought at the Bournemouth Orchid Society show, which would have been March last year, 2019. So at this point I'd had them a year. They were in a sorry state, all 3 of them, although this one was slightly better than the other 2. Basically virtually rootless, and what they were in I was far from happy with. It was a soggy mess, quite honestly. Now it may have been better if the watering had been controlled, but I got a feeling they got absolutely drowned to be brought to the show, and had been kept far too wet over a period of time, especially as that was the colder part of the year then. It was, you know, quite cold. Anyway, that's how it started life. It got repotted not long after I got it. So at this particular point it wasn't doing bad. It had come through the winter, which is okay for Miltoniopsis. They do like to grow cool, so winter time is not a bad time for these to re-establish themselves. It's not a good idea to repot Miltoniopsis, you know, in the middle of the summer. They're already under stress. So it looked okay. It wasn't doing bad. There were some signs of new growths, so, and signs of some new roots. So it was trying to establish itself from what I can only say was a very, very, very poor start in life with me. So let's see how that one got on. Now the Miltoniopsis is, I'll call it hanging in there. Bearing in mind it was almost rootless when it was potted up. We do now have some roots growing down into the pot. I wouldn't say it's an extensive root system. The trouble with it is the newer growths that it's put out have climbed slightly. So there's some new roots coming out that are not going straight into the media. And some of them have dried up as a consequence. But got a little bit of concertina leaf on this one. But this is the problem you get. Having climbed slightly and the roots are now high, the next new growth is coming out there. Inside 2 leaves. Now the roots are going to have a hell of a job to get out of that new growth and get anywhere near the media. So it's a problem. I've got a feeling there's, are there any other new growths on this one? Sure I saw one last time I watered it. Because at first I thought it was a spike. I thought, oh goody. Yeah, see there's one down in there, look. It's right inside. There's no way the roots are going to escape and actually get into the media. So I might have to strip off some leaves to actually allow these new growths to get into something. But at least there are some. So, you know, we have. So there's one down in there. And that's on one of the climbing new growths. So that's now pushing out a second new growth on top of the one it already had. So it's growing. And this is not a good time of year for Miltoniopsis in here either, because it's you know, they've got the heat. Now this was a worry a while back because these look like wet patches, which would be a bacterial issue. But they didn't come to anything. They didn't come to anything. So all I can say about that is I have no idea. But any bacterial rot you've got to get on top of fast. You know, that's all I can say. Otherwise you could lose your plant. And that, you know, that was one of those, I kept my eye on it daily and it stopped. There's a couple more on that leaf. they're old, they stopped. So all I can say on this is that we have a couple of new growths that are not in an ideal position. We have some root growth that's not in an ideal position, but it's not going downhill, let's put it that way. And I suspect this growth here, the roots, some of these roots are going to get down into the media, so there will be some new root growth into the pot. So yeah, somebody said earlier in the year, because there's a set of 3 of these, they were all got back at our show, which would have been last year in March. Yeah, March last year. And somebody actually said they'll all be dead by the end of the year. Well, not dead yet. And there's some growth and there's some roots. So all I can say is it's progressing. This is another one as well as can be expected. These don't like the heat. Now I've got them out of the bright light because for a Miltoniopsis the leaf colour's quite good. It's meant to be a silvery green colour. They're not meant to be a deep green, but they're also not meant to be a pale yellowy colour. They're this greyish green colour. So I'm happy with the leaf colour. So I would say the amount of light it's getting is fine. Very, very low feeders, and hate any sort of build up in the pot of excess feed, excess salt. So I flush this more often than I feed it, and when I feed it, it doesn't get that much. But nonetheless, it's as well as can be expected, and certainly not dead yet. I don't think any of the existing growths are going to bloom. So we've got to wait for some other growths to mature, which may not be until next year. But again, blooms are gorgeous on this, worth waiting for. And getting a healthier plant, quite honestly, is more important than getting some blooms, because the plant was in a bad way when I got it, virtually rootless. And for quite a large plant, in non-ideal conditions, to have a small root system that was virtually non-existent, I'm surprised the plant didn't die, quite honestly. But it's pulled through, so we'll see what we can do with it now. It's going to be slow progress now until we get to sort of October time when the temperatures drop down. So but as long as it can hang in there through that period and at least push on, you know, these 2 little new growths, then it should be okay when it gets back in its comfort zone. So that's that one. Now the little Miltoniopsis species, which was a gift, it was one of 2, and unfortunately the other one, which is incredibly rare, didn't make it. It was in a sorry state. This one wasn't exactly in a brilliant state, but it hung in there. So we got this one potted up, and there were some signs of some growth at this point. It arrived last year sometime. I can't remember again, you know, dates and things like that are lost in my notes due to the great laptop crash of 2020. That's how that's going to be called. We've had financial crashes. Well, I had a laptop crash, and it did actually lose me some important stuff. So it will be remembered as the great laptop crash of 2020. I love having little things like that. Anyway, this was hanging in there. There were some signs of some root growth. Leaves had stopped dropping off because I did lose a few leaves. It seemed to be stabilising. Tiny little plant, and unknown whether it's just a very, very young plant or it is actually a small species. But nonetheless, a species, Miltoniopsis. So I was looking forward to hoping this was going to grow. Now in the world of Miltoniopsis, I've only ever dealt with hybrids, some more complex than others, and some are so far away from any species that they've lost all recognition. This is a species, so one would naturally assume it's going to be more difficult to grow. That's not across the board, but it is often the case that species are just more fussy. And yet this one, I'd safely say, has exceeded expectations because it's growing pretty good, despite being a species. new growths are pushing on quite nicely, and we've got a lot of them. We've got this large one now sticking out to the left. Then the bulb that it's growing out of has another new growth coming out the other side, up through a leaf. There's another new growth there, and another new growth there by the label. That's got 4 new growths on it. They're all pushing on reasonably well, and this had no roots basically. And now it's got some. There's some active root growth in this little pot. It's growing. Now, whether we're going to get any blooms on any of these growths, I really don't know. But just the comparison in the size of this plant, how tiny it is compared with the hybrid we just looked at that was up here, literally. So, very tiny, delicate little plant, and growing. And strangely enough, does not have that silvery grey-green colour. It has a more normal green. There's a slight greyish tinge, I suppose, on the older leaves, but yeah, considering the sort of state it was in when I got it, I think this one's pulling on quite nicely. Problem there, not quite sure what, but the rest of the growth's okay, and the rest of the other new growths are okay. So it's progressing at a rate I never expected from a species Miltoniopsis, even though you know, this could be classed as a vigorous species, I don't know. But the Miltoniopsis are montane forest dwellers, basically, which is why they're different from the Miltonias. Technically, they are the same thing. The Miltoniopsis are Miltonias that come from a different part of the world and a different environment, but they're technically still Miltonias. They were just given that Miltoniopsis as a way of differentiating. And I think there's only about 5 in existence in the wild, and I think one of them's on its way out as well. But anyway, it's growing, pleased with its progress. I suppose we could cross everything and perhaps hope to see some blooms. That will be good. A species Miltoniopsis in bloom. But yeah, I could look forward to that. That's that one. And the little phalaenopsis has had a hard life. My daughter almost killed it as she was coming up for a surgery and everything, when plants were the least thing on her mind. Lost its root system completely, came down to me, got sat in a pot of sphagnum moss for almost 2 years and did nothing. And then it just decided to push out a new leaf, and it managed to grow a root. But I was determined that the few Paphiopedilums that I've got were not going to stay in their pot and their media start to break down. So this one was on the list of stuff to be repotted annually. It hadn't actually been done in March. It was due to be done in the near future, hoping that there was at least a root, or some roots would be even better, but very, very slow progress. The new leaf on it was half size. Whether it had finished growing at this point, I didn't know, but it had grown a new leaf. It had also lost one, so it hadn't gained anything. Right, so the progress on this miniature little Paphiopedilum is 0, but actually it isn't. There is progress underground. Above ground, we've still got the 4 leaves we had last time, although the newest leaf has actually grown a little bit bigger than it was in the photo we've just seen. Beautiful patterning on these leaves, I absolutely love it. And quite honestly, there is just a sign of a new leaf, I believe, possibly. But what has happened, having spent 2 years totally rootless, and still amazed how it managed to hang on in there, it did actually produce a root. And I found that my Paphiopedilums need repotting frequently because of the moss. So this has had a repot along with the other 2, and we're trying out no moss. So what we've actually got now is charcoal, perlite and small bark. The idea being that the charcoal will keep it sweet and the moss won't make it break down too quickly, so I might be able to stay in there a little bit longer. But these love getting repotted. They seem to enjoy it. The roots seem to put a bit of a spurt on with some fresh media. But nonetheless, there was a decent root and a sign of another one starting to grow, I believe. So there is a bit of progress underground. I can't see this blooming for a while yet, but its size shouldn't fool you really. It is a miniature, it doesn't grow large. But what it really could do is putting up another new growth would be good. That would be great expectations, to expect to see a new growth. But something, it needs to do something as a plant existing in the plant world, expecting to perpetuate itself. It needs to do something. So it's either got to produce a bloom or convince itself that this actual growth is never going to bloom, so put a new one up. Both would be good. Anyway, but these are notoriously slow growing at the end of the day. That's why I don't grow them to any great extent. But I could quite happily have a couple of these purely for the patterning on the leaves, which is absolutely gorgeous. So that's an attractive plant. Deep purple colouring underneath, beautiful markings, just very, very slow progress. But it hasn't gone downhill. That's the main thing, considering the struggle it's had to even live. So to go from totally rootless, being kept in totally the wrong environment, totally neglected, it's recovered enough to at least produce a root that was a decent root, and since then it's produced a couple of leaves. So we do have some progress, although it doesn't show much on this one. So there we go then. That's the end of part 4, the cooler, shadier types. Bit of an assortment there, different types, and that puts update 1 to bed now. So that can all be hived off onto my hard drive, ready for next time round, which will be update 2, which will be in 3 months' time. So that was June, July, August. That'll be September, won't it? Yeah. So days will be getting shorter. In theory, with the shorter days, there's less heat, and even if the heat's still there, it's not there for as long. See what I mean? So there is less heat in total because it's not there for as long. The days are getting shorter. So we'll see how we do there. In theory, all of the ones we've just looked at in part 4 are not going to do that well over the next 3 months. It's not their time, being the cooler growers. But we'll see what they look like in 3 months' time. Hope you've enjoyed the set of 4 parts and the various plants that were chosen, and we'll get back to them in 3 months' time. See you next time.